Welcome to Run for PRs, where we explore the world of running, fitness, and everything in between. I'm Victoria Philippi, your host, and today we're diving deep into a popular goal for many runners: how to train for a half marathon. Whether you're a newbie or a seasoned runner looking to improve your time, this episode is going to be packed with tips to help cross your finish line in the time that you want. So first, we're just going to dive into understanding what the half marathon is. A half marathon is a race that covers 13.1 miles, which is roughly 21 kilometers. It's a great distance for those who want a challenge but aren't quite ready to tackle that full 26.2 miles of a marathon, or they just want to mix it up and not focus on the marathon. So oftentimes if someone has that bucket list goal of doing a full marathon, they'll typically do a half marathon before. But that's not necessarily a requirement to doing a marathon. For example, I ran my first marathon in 2013 and I never did an official half marathon race before that day. So you definitely can do a full marathon as your first race, but a lot of people will do a half marathon first. And oftentimes there are people who are marathoners who will just do a 13.1 mile race just to race that half marathon distance. So they're both great distances. It's just good to know what you're getting into. And I often find that when you focus on that half marathon distance, it can actually make you a better marathoner because it's a shorter distance, but it's still a long distance race where you're able to practice your pacing, practice your fueling, and really dial into how to push yourself over a long distance. And the things you learn from racing a half marathon can be really applicable to doing a marathon race. Training for this distance comes with numerous benefits, not just for your physical health, but also your mental well-being. Many people find the training process teaches discipline and can be a really great way to set a personal challenge. And it's also a really good milestone for people who do want to do a marathon to check that, hey, I did a half marathon. It can really boost your confidence level going into marathon training.
Yeah, so understanding the distance, the half marathon, if this is new to you, then it's going to feel almost like you're running a marathon for the first time because it is pretty far, right? 13.1 miles, which is roughly 21 kilometers. It's typically it's sort of like the first long distance race that people would do, especially if they've done a 5K or maybe they've done a 5K, then a 10K. Then it's kind of like the next logical step up, right? Is you want to cover this distance, confidently before you would attempt to double the distance in your first marathon. So I think for myself, my own personal journey with this, I had several years of running experience running up to about 5K or 8K. And that was in college and high school, just doing a lot of like road races as well as races on the track and cross country courses. And then I started to get into the first time I ran a half marathon was grandma's, probably back in 2010 maybe. And so I think I did probably three half marathons before I attempted my first marathon. And so it was, I think I was quite surprised by how, if you train really hard for a few years, it does translate up to a certain extent, but I definitely lacked the endurance. Like I was feeling it by mile 7 or 8. I was able to kind of adjust my goal, my pace during the race. And because I had a background with racing, shorter distance races, I knew how I wanted to feel getting to about 80% of the race. So I knew I wanted to feel a certain way at mile 10. So I sort of just kind of adjusted my pace and I was able to finish strong. But a funny story about that is I've really only improved on my time, I think by like 40 seconds, 30 seconds from that first time I ever ran a half marathon. And so it's kind of crazy to think like I've ran the same time about 4 times.
Yeah, but I mean, what time did you run?
1:13 and a half, so it's about 5:38 pace or so.
Right. The margin, when I feel like that law of diminishing returns. So for newer listeners or people who haven't heard that concept before, it's when you have gotten really close to your potential or you're getting faster, it's harder to make incremental improvements. And so if you are someone who is really capitalizing already on your speed, you might have to train for years really specifically just to shave a couple seconds off of a time, like a half marathon or a marathon. And so that's probably where you were at. So when people hear, 40 seconds, it really just depends on where you're at. For some people, 40 seconds is a lot in a half marathon. For other people, that would be disappointing. But that dives us into our next topic is how do you set goals for half marathons? And there's so many different goals that you can set within the sport of running, and that's really going to determine how you train, right? So it's really important to have a goal, and it's crucial to have a clear, achievable target as you begin training. Maybe your goal is simply to just finish your half marathon. Maybe you just want to finish under that time limit, which is usually around 3 hours, but definitely check the race website to see what it is at your specific race. But other times you're looking to beat a previous time. So for a lot of maybe like seasoned runners, they go through a phase where they want to set PRs at every race, and that really, it becomes their thing, is setting time goals. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about PRs, PBs. They're trying to run faster than previous times. Now, that's not the only goal that you can have, but as a coach, I tend to find a lot of my athletes want to set personal bests in the distances that they're doing. But for other people who've maybe been running for a really long time, or if they had a baby and they took time off and they're coming back into the sport, there are some people who might set other benchmark goals. So maybe you had 2 kids, you haven't really done a half marathon race in 6 years. Pre-kids, in your late 20s, you were running a 1:45 half, but now you feel like you're kind of starting over from ground zero, even though you're not really technically. But since it's your first half back in 6 years, you might think in your head of a different time goal. Maybe your time goal is 2 hours. And whatever feels comfortable for you, but also feels like a little bit of a stretch, a little challenge, that's a really good way to set a goal. And you want your goal to be something that is within your wheelhouse. I think when we have goals that are so high, it can almost not set us up for success, because if it's so high and it's not realistic, it can be really defeating to show up every day and not be able to hit your paces, or to have your expectations so high that it's not even possible to achieve that specific goal. So right now, my fastest half marathon time is 1:19 from a Revel race that I did a couple of years ago. And if I just decided, hey, I want to go do this really hilly half marathon and try to beat my personal record from this downhill course, that wouldn't be setting myself up for success, because you can't really compare times on a downhill course to something that's really hilly. And so knowing the course you're going into, knowing where your current fitness level is at, that can help set up your training plan. So maybe your training plan, maybe you're like, I don't want to set a PR. I just want to finish the race. I've done half marathons before. What's the minimum I have to do? It's like, well, maybe you only have to run 3 days a week, and we can be a little bit more chill with it. But if you have a super aggressive goal, like Jason, let's say you really wanted to run a half marathon PR, you would have to really get after it and set yourself up for success by extending the training cycle, by running high mileage, by really being specific of what workouts you were doing in order to achieve that goal. So the higher the goal relative to where you're currently at, the more strict you're going to have to be with your training plan.
Yeah, I like that. And I don't think I would even attempt to run a certain time for that distance unless I was able to hit certain benchmarks in a 5K and a 10K, just because I know what the prereq is. You know, I need to be able to carry this pace for this X amount of distance. And so, yeah, maybe you gave some good examples of people running a half marathon. And I think if it's your first one, sometimes you might just want to look at your 10K time if you've done that, or your 5K time, and obviously you can plug that into a calculator and you can try to get an estimate. But you definitely want to be approaching the race at a lot slower pace, right? So if it's a 10K, you're doubling the distance. You definitely want to slow down by at least 20 to 30 seconds a mile. And I always tell athletes, break the race into really 2 parts. If you're going to run it kind of for fun and just to feel strong, at mile 10, that's your green light. If you're feeling good, then you can run the last 5K hard. And so that's a good approach too to take. And setting your goals, it's really going to be about your experience, your recent training, all of that. And then you will hopefully have a pretty good idea of what sorts of tempo, paces you've held in training and so on.
I really liked how you mentioned that you would have to hit specific benchmarks in shorter distance races in order to even feel comfortable going after that specific time goal in the half marathon. And I think that's really important to bring that up. I think going into any training cycle, you should have benchmarks in a shorter distance race or in prior experience in workouts indicating that it's within your wheelhouse. And what does that mean? So maybe you do a 5K race and you plug that into a VDOT calculator to see what are my projected times. So let's say you really want to run a sub 1:30 half marathon, and you recently ran a 23-minute 5K. Well, if you plugged a 23-minute 5K into the VDOT calculator, you're really not going to be anywhere near a 1:30 half marathon. It's probably going to say something closer to like just off the top of my head, I'm guessing here, it's probably going to say 1:46, 1:47 for a half marathon. And so I would say it'd be not realistic to go after the 1:30. I would say a stretch goal then would probably be closer to that 1:45, 1:46 half marathon. It would be a stretch goal, and it would be maybe an aggressive goal to set, but it would still be realistic. But if you set a goal, say you're at a 23-minute 5K right now, if you set your goal to run a 1:35 half, that it just isn't realistic. So you want to make sure that your goals are in alignment with reality. But diving into the next part is, how do you frame up that training plan? So you can actually gain fitness within the training cycle. So maybe you're at that 23-minute 5K mark right now, but I don't really know your background. Maybe you've been at the 18-minute 5K mark before and you just took 2 years off of training. And so as you get into it and you run that 18-minute 5K in a couple of months, well, yeah, maybe you can run that sub 1:30 half eventually. So there are many different plans available, and it's really important to find a plan that fits your current fitness level and your needs as an athlete. Typically, training plans for a half marathon will span anywhere between 10 to 20 weeks, and they include long runs, different quality sessions like speed workouts or tempo workouts. And then for some athletes, we include cross training. So activities such as cycling or swimming, when we can't build your mileage as quickly as some people would like to, we like to add in some of these cross training activities because it is less impact on the joints, but it's still able to improve your aerobic fitness, which is key for long distance endurance events. And then finally, there's rest days. Do not underestimate these. They help your body recover. For beginners, I really recommend taking a minimum of 2 rest days per week. One of them can be a little bit more active, like you can go for a walk and whatnot. But if you're really truly a beginner runner, I don't really want to see them running more than 4 days per week. If you're a beginner, you haven't ran more than a 5K before and you're trying to really ramp up for half marathon, because ramping up for a long distance event is a huge stress on the body already. And if you're trying to increase how many days per week you're running, that can just be a lot. And so we always want to make sure we're balancing that risk versus reward. And so it can be kind of risky to really go all the way in and ramp up really quickly. So we want to just make sure that we stay healthy and have a sustainable approach. So it's really important that when you are looking for training plans, that you find something that's going to be where you are at currently and not overwork you too much in the beginning, because I oftentimes see people get that injury or burnout as they progress in the training. Maybe they're fine the first couple of weeks, but as things compound over time and they're not able to recover, that's where we see some of these things occur.
Yeah, I really like when adults who have done a lot of marathons decide to go all in on the half marathon, right? So then they can really focus on just maximizing their training towards that half distance. You know, they don't need to be doing 16, 17, 18-mile long runs. Now, obviously, elites, they still train at that level. But for most adults, you know, we're going to be maxing our long runs between 10 to 14 miles for most people. And so the nice part about it is it doesn't take as long to recover from those, and you can maybe get a little bit more quality during the week. And as far as like key workouts, I just love doing a lot of like threshold work, a lot of mile type repeats, stuff like that. I feel like that really helps with building strength, building confidence, you know, mixing in your occasional fartlek and speed workout too. Because it is important to have speed, you know, during a half marathon, but 98 to 99% of the race is aerobic. So you want to train similar to marathon. You just don't need to be doing as many longer runs or long steady state runs.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really like what you had to add there. So the workouts that you're doing, those quality sessions or those faster runs throughout the week, we like to recommend that people do around 80% of their volume is at that easy, like zone 2, super chill, conversational efforts to build that aerobic base. But then 20% of your volume should be at those harder efforts. So like you mentioned, those harder workouts at threshold, the speed work, and that is going to be probably the biggest differentiator that's going to make or break the PR, right? What you're doing on those workout days. So the specifics of what workouts you do are so key. I oftentimes see people who will race workouts, and so then they're never really able to fully recover in between sessions because they're going too hard and there's just a lack of recovery time in between for how hard they are going. And really, the changes that happen that are going to help you develop into a stronger runner, like increasing your VO2 max, lowering your threshold, all of those things only happen if you're able to recover from the workouts. If you're not properly recovering, what you're doing is just digging a bigger hole, and so you won't gain fitness, and in fact you might actually see a regression in fitness over time if you're continuing to dig that hole. So it's going to be really important to make sure that you're training at the appropriate paces. One thing I like all my runners to do at the beginning of a training cycle is to either do some sort of a race, like a 5K, just to see where their fitness is at, or we will do a time trial or maybe a little test out workout just to see where their fitness is at. So even if you've been working with an athlete for a while, or even if you feel really confident with what sort of time that you would run at a 5K, I would like to go out and test that, because even myself, I know myself as a runner pretty well, and there's been times where I feel like I'm in this type of 5K shape and then I go out and do the race and it's actually, maybe I'm 10 seconds per mile off what I thought. And in either direction, in a workout, 10 seconds per mile, that's actually a lot. I know when we say that, it's like, how is 10 seconds per mile that much? 10 seconds per mile can be the difference between you racing a workout or doing it appropriately. And so it can be the difference between a training cycle where you feel good, you have the gains, versus a training cycle where you overtrained a little bit, you didn't make the progress. And so all of that work that you did over the 16 weeks could be, I don't want to say all for nothing, but it could be not doing what you think it's doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. As I get a new athlete, sometimes I look at their recent training and their intake and everything, and sometimes you do get those athletes who they run a 5K time so much faster, right, or a time trial time so much faster than what their half marathon time PR is, and so I feel like that is pretty common, and I think that we're going to focus a lot then on the threshold and the half marathon pace work, right, because that tells me that they have a lot of speed. But that other runner, and I did get someone like this recently who they ran a really fast half PR recently, a couple months ago, but their time trial time was, it equated to a lot slower half marathon time on the VDOT. And so for her, I kind of had to use some judgment and look at past racing experiences and everything. And we had to sort of figure out what are the accurate training paces that we want to target. And for her, we might want to do a lot more like speed endurance, because if that strength is already there, we're going to maybe shift more to the threshold and the speed interval work as opposed to doing, more half marathon pace work. So yeah, just a little tidbit there on the training, how that might vary based on an individual's strengths and their background.
Definitely. Pacing. Yeah, and I don't know what you love to see, but I love seeing when someone has a fast 5K time and their half or full marathon time is just not in the same ballpark. So for example, if someone's done like a 21-minute 5K and then they come and we see on their intake form, or they fill out a form on our website and they say their marathon time's like 4:30.
Right.
I'm like, wow, you're gonna set an hour PR this year. Like, I get excited because I wonder if they know that. And so really, if you have that fast 5K time and then you're not equating in the longer distance races, that should actually really excite you, because all that's telling me is that like all we have to do is make a few tweaks and you're just going to crush it, because the speed is already there. Yeah. It's simply endurance work at this point. And you're really going to probably wow yourself, because I do find a lot of those people that maybe they had a really bad marathon experience. Like even myself, my first marathon did not go as I hoped back, 12 years ago. But when you have that bad first marathon experience, I feel like you're really humbled. And so any subsequent experiences you just really appreciate. And so it can be tough when it's the other way around, because then you really have to work on, okay, what are we going to do to improve this person's VO2 max, at the same time also working on that endurance stuff. So that can be a little bit more tricky, but that's when having a coach can be really working to your advantage, because no two training plans are alike, right? The one athlete that's a 21-minute 5K PR that's run the 4:30 marathon, we're going to probably train in a much different manner than an athlete that comes with a 21-minute 5K PR that runs a 3:29 marathon. They're going to have very different trainings, and everything is just really specific to that individual. But diving into the next part of this half marathon podcast, I feel like we veered a little bit off track here, is the nutrition and hydration. So you can get away with no nutrition and no hydration in a 5K. And I mean, you could probably even stretch it to a 10K depending on how long you're going to be out there. But this is where we're diving into these longer distance races. These things are going to start coming into play. And it's really good to start practicing this now instead of waiting until maybe race day or saying, oh, I'm not going to do that until I do a marathon. No, like let's go for it now, even if you're not going to be out there for 90 minutes, because I know everyone always says, oh, the nutrition stuff comes into play, the fueling comes into play after 90 minutes. I do a lot of half marathons under 90 minutes, and I always am fueling for them. So it's really important to have that fueling strategy, have that hydration strategy. So training for a half marathon isn't just about the running and the run training. Nutrition plays a critical role. Fueling your body properly can make significant difference in your performance. Focus on a diet rich in carbohydrates, and don't forget hydration. Aim to drink water and electrolytes throughout the day, and even during, after your runs, practicing that when you're going at a fast pace, because I actually think racing a half marathon and taking in liquids is probably harder than racing a marathon taking in liquids, because you're going at a faster pace. So grabbing those cups becomes more challenging. Simply getting the water down is more challenging. So I think if you practice that, that can be really beneficial. And one way you could practice it is if you have a 5K or 10K within the buildup, you could practice taking water at those races, just grabbing the cup. You don't even necessarily have to drink that much, but I think just practice grabbing the cup at a fast pace in a race environment so that you have that experience and you're able to do that in shorter distance races can come into play when you are going up in distance.
Yeah, that's really well said. I think, you know, the recommendations that we would want to see athletes hit for carbs and sodium per hour during a marathon, that would apply to the half as well. So, you know, for optimal performance, right? Because you are depleting your energy storages by the end of that half if you're racing it all out, and so you could potentially cramp up in a half if you get depleted of sodium, you know. And so you want to still supplement with something, whether it's on course hydration, the Gatorade, or maybe you have a small handheld, or you find someone on the course that gives you something, and then you can toss it right after you consume it. Whatever it is, I know I've done halves where I carry a salt stick pills, and then you can just pop them in your mouth as you're getting close to a water station. So, but yeah, as far as grams of carbs, that's going to depend on body weight, but probably anywhere from 40 to 80, you know, grams per hour. So it might be one gel, it could be 2 gels depending on the size.
Definitely.
4 gels. Yep.
Yeah, and even if you're going to be running for less than 90 minutes, you still want to get that fuel in because it can make a big difference, and practicing with it is super important. And next, we're going to be diving into the importance of rest and recovery. So we've talked a lot about the training plan, the fueling, all of those things. Everyone knows that that's super important, but it's also really important to be recovering from all of this high stress training. It's crucial to understand the importance of rest days. Your muscles need time to heal and grow stronger after those intense training sessions. Incorporating active recovery like gentle yoga or light walking to keep your body moving without that added strain on those rest days. Listen to your body though. If you're feeling over fatigued, or you notice that you're having like persistent aches, or some days if you just wake up and you're exhausted, I would definitely modify and take an additional rest day, because within the course of a training cycle, you are inevitably going to have days where you wake up and you're like, whoa, I feel really off. I'm really tired, and you don't want to push through on those days. I think we all have days where we're just a little tired, and it's okay to maybe push through that, but there are days where we all know we wake up and we feel off, and on those days, give yourself an extra rest day. Give yourself a day, maybe you only go out on like a 20-minute easy run, push your workout back. It's really important to listen to your body on those days, because it could be a sign that maybe you're fighting off an infection or something and you're in those early stages. And when we push through, when we're maybe getting sick or we're feeling like we need that extra recovery, it can actually dig us into that hole like I was talking about earlier. So rest is really important. I like to incorporate 1 rest day per week. And I just like to have it be on Sundays, because I'm really bad about taking it, you know, when I quote unquote need it. I struggle with that. So if you're a type A person that really struggles with taking the rest when you need it, I definitely think having a minimum of 1 rest day per week on the calendar is really important. And oftentimes people will reach out and ask me, what can I do on a rest day? And I would say just do as little as possible, especially if you're a parent. So a lot of parents follow me and they have young children. And so in that environment, you're already having a really active lifestyle. I know on my rest days, even if I stay confined to the house, I will easily get between 10 and 12,000 steps simply from parenting. And so you don't want to overdo it, right? So if you're already getting 10,000 steps in a day with just your day-to-day activities, I think that's plenty. We don't need to go on a 2-mile walk. We don't need to do like a 4-mile hike. I would consider those activities to be quote unquote workouts. I mean, like going on a 4-mile hike is a lot. And I've had people reach out and say, can I go on a 4-mile hike on my rest day? And I'm like, well, yes, but that's I don't consider that a rest day then. Unless you're talking like a really chill, flat, maybe just a 4-mile walk and you're going to literally veg the rest of the day. But you really want to be conscious to what is our body really going to be going through that day. And if you already have a really busy, hectic schedule, less is more on these rest days.
Yeah, with recovery, that doesn't always necessarily mean the same as a rest day. So if you don't run 6 days a week, you could rest 1 day, you could run like 4 days or whatever. That still leaves 2 days for active recovery. So you could do cross training, right? You could do just getting on the bike, doing a little easy spin, or maybe like to swim. Those things can still help, complement your training and give you a little bit of an edge there in terms of improving your endurance. So and as far as like recovery from the actual race itself, I always found that it took me as long to recover from a half and then it did as a full marathon. And that was just probably, I was really emptying the bucket there in the half as far as knowing, reaching my potential. And so I think that I was completely destroyed. It took me well over a week to feel normal again. So I think that that's normal too. Don't underestimate how hard a half is.
Right. It all just depends on how hard you're pushing on race day for sure. I mean,